God beside you, who's going to protect you? God. So anyhow, just let me know, and I'll plug in.
Well, good evening. Turn to 2 Samuel 21. 2 Samuel 21, 10 through 14. 2 Samuel 21, 10 through 14. This is so I don't fall asleep during the message. You guys can get away with it. I can't. I think it's a double standard. But anyway. 2 Samuel 21, 10 through 14. A message entitled Last Respects. So if you pay your last respects, it's usually something you do for someone who just recently died, and you show your respect or affection for them by coming to see their body, coming to the grave, attending their funeral. Usually sometime within vicinity of the funeral, you might do something that person enjoyed in honor or memory of them. Maybe it's you gather together as a family and watch their favorite movie, or go have dinner at their favorite place, or you might go do an activity or go visit a spot that you enjoyed with them or had a special memory with them. I think all of us have an instance somewhere in there where we've paid our last respects towards someone in one form or another. And we're going to see that theme of properly paying last respects in tonight's passage. 2 Samuel 21, 10 through 14. Now Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock, from the beginning of harvest until the late rains poured on them from heaven. And she did not allow the birds of the air to rest on them by day, nor the beasts of the field by night. And David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul, had done. And then David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from the men of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the street of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them up, after the Philistines had struck down Saul and Gilboa. He brought up the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan his son from there. And they gathered the bones of those who had been hanged. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan his son in the country of Benjamin and Zelah, in the tomb of Kish his father. So they performed all the king commanded, and after that God heeded the prayer for the land. So as we talked about last week at the start of chapter 21, not only towards the end of 2 Samuel, but we're also towards the end of the reign of David. He's reigned some 40 years. Israel total, give or take. This is definitely towards the last 5-10 years of that reign. And in the last 3 years of that reign, the land has been facing a famine. Now, again, I'm talking about we don't have a good concept of famine in America. Since we ate before service, we'll probably eat after service, and if not, we'll definitely eat in the morning. Most of us don't even have. The only reason any of us have ever skipped a meal recently is just because we were too busy and we didn't have time to eat. It wasn't because it was a lack of food. Now, famine is still a serious issue in lots of other parts of the world, but not America. But this is in the desert, and the famine had become so strong and so severe that even the king's household didn't have any food. So David inquired of the Lord and found out that it was the result of a grievous sin committed by King Saul some 40 plus years ago against the Gibeonites. And Saul had attempted to commit a mass genocide against the Gibeonites. This was bad in general, but this was especially bad based off the people it was against. And so David brings the Gibeonites before him and goes, hey, Saul did y'all real wrong. How can I make peace with you guys? And they say, we want 7 descendants of Saul to face judgment on his behalf. David hands the 7 over, and they are executed by hanging. This is really important to note because the Old Testament law stated that cursed was everyone who hangs on a tree. It's a form of execution that was viewed as particularly bad. It's important to note also that the bodies were never buried. They were left hanging. There's a couple of reasons you would do this. One, it was a reminder to everyone that these people were particularly heinous individuals, and they were executed as a form of judgment and was looked at as God was displeased with them, or as if God Almighty had struck them down. Secondly, it served as a warning to make sure you never did what they did. Just like you see in the old pirate movies, when they come in the harbor, there's always at least one skeleton in pirate gear hanging with the sign pirate on there, just to remind you of the penalties of doing that. Now, some of us would read this and think, this doesn't seem fair. They didn't do anything wrong. You can see where you would get that. I thought that for a while as well. So, one, based off the biblical narrative, we actually don't know their level of guilt or innocence because it never actually says. Two, we can presume some level of guilt on their behalf because, one, this came from God and God is just. Two, David nor the Gibeonites face any type of judgment or reprimand because of this. And three, it actually does successfully stop the famine, so it shows God was behind this the entire time. So the next question, well, if they were guilty, what did they do? I don't know, because the narrative does not tell us. I have a couple of guesses, though. I imagine that they were being executed for a crime that they thought they had gotten away with. Going all the way back to the days of Joshua, some 400 years prior to this, the Gibeonites were considered a protected class of people. This was a sacred oath between the Gibeonites and the Israelites, and with oath with God as the witness. So to break that oath not only was to dishonor the promise, but it was to dishonor God, who was said to be the covenant maker and keeper of that promise. So most likely, these 7 descendants of Saul were involved in that Gibeonite genocide. So homeschool my kids has talked about, and in civics, Madison has been learning about government, and then more specifically the legal system, the judicial system, are innocent until proven guilty, and charges and different penalties and all that fun stuff that you learn in 5th grade history class. And so we were talking today while we were going down the road, and we were talking about different degrees of crime. Some crimes may get you a day or two in jail, and then some crimes get you life. She goes, so like if you murdered somebody, that's really bad, and you go to jail for a long time. And I'm like, yes. And then she goes, has anyone ever gotten away with murder? And I'm like, I'm certain of that, baby. And she goes, well, how many people? And I'm like, well, I don't have an exact number because they got away with it, right? I said, however, I can guarantee you every last one of them will face judgment one day. And she goes, so people would catch them in this life, maybe, maybe not. But it's important to all of us once to die and then face judgment. So I say, so whether or not they get away with it in this life, no one gets away with it when they die. We all stand before God. We all face the judgment. And she goes, that's why we need Jesus. That's right, baby. Proud daddy moment for a minute there. Thank you, all of you who poured your life and prayers and godly counsel into her. I'm definitely seeing that form into aspects of her personality. So all of us face judgment one way or the other, and in essence, nobody's ever gotten away with anything, theologically speaking. Maybe for a time, but at some point or another, the bill always comes due, right? We all stand before God in judgment. And so, for whatever reason, the bill came due for these 7 guys, and they paid it. So Rizpah, a lady that we only see a couple times in the narrative, was a concubine of King Saul. So she goes out to pay her last respects to her 2 sons and these 5 other gentlemen that she was not related to. So she brings a big thing of sackcloth. You ever do like the sack race as a kid, or like know what sackcloth is? It's real scratchy and unpleasant. Well, that was the traditional sign of mourning. In Old Testament times, you would tear your garments and you would put on sackcloth because it was extremely uncomfortable to show everyone you were also extremely uncomfortable in mourning. And so she stretches this out on the rocks. So imagine having a nice nap on a bunch of rocks laying on some sackcloth. That's just lovely, right? And so she makes a pallet on the rocks with this sackcloth, and then she begins to keep watch. She chases away birds, animals, opportunistic thieves, because back then clothing was a rare commodity. It's not like in America where we have bins where we throw clothing away in, right, to be recycled, or we pay people to take our clothing for us. Back then, if you owned 2 outfits, you were doing really good at that point. And so a lot of times, one of the things grave robbers would steal would be whatever the burial clothes were, because clothing was such a rare commodity back then. So she's there, and she's running off, scavenger beasts, birds, possibly grave robbers, all these things. And she does this for a while. So we don't know when the early and latter rains come because it's been raining nonstop since like September here. So we just figure it's like that everywhere else, right? Well, where she is in Israel, the early rains are April-ish. The latter rains are October-ish. That means from April to October, she was out there in this. And all the weather that the desert has to bring. Now imagine how difficult and gruesome this was. Her bed was sackcloth over rocks. She was outside in the desert, which is not known for being cool and comfortable weather-wise, right? She was there constantly chasing away scavengers of all type. I like to remind you, this is back before embalming. So she would have watched the bodies of these 7 men, 2 of which were her son, decay very slowly day after day. Also, this was the desert in the summer, and it was hot out there, and there were 7 rotten bodies in the summer sun. I'm willing to bet you that was not a pleasant smell by any stretch of the imagination. This is some serious dedication to paying one's last respects. So David hears about this. It says, and David was told what Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, the concubine of Saul had done. So David hears this, and the question we have is, how is David going to respond? First couple of days of her being out there, this might have been a common thing, protecting bodies from scavengers and whatnot. So maybe not a whole lot of people take notice, but she stayed out there, she stayed out there, and she stayed out there. And it would have been obvious she was out there because where they hung them was only about 3 miles north of the palace, and it was on a hill so everyone could see it. So just by going near these bodies, in essence, she was sacrificing what little reputation she might have had left because these men were accursed of God. And therefore, they would assume, oh, she's associating with dead bodies that are accursed of God. So she was ceremonially unclean. Therefore, she could not come and worship God because of this as well. So a lot of people would have looked down upon this. A lot of people would have talked about this. And this talking about it comes towards the king. So how's David going to respond? These people that were hung were essentially his enemy, right? None of these people were protected by David. It's a possibility that these people had also been involved or at least helped with some of the other rebellions and civil wars that David was a part of because they were of descendants of Saul. They were of the tribe of Benjamin. And the first civil war David went through was specifically with some of the descendants of Saul. Either way, these are men who had brought famine upon the land and difficulty upon the land and death upon the land for 3 years. How is he going to respond? People would consider a gracious response of, well, if that's what she wants to do, let her go do what she wants. That would have been gracious. Most likely, all of this was making the people uncomfortable and awkward because every time they walked past, they saw her out there. Maybe they even felt a little convicted about something or another, seeing her dedication to her sons in this manner. And so they're going to tell David. In essence, they're telling David so he'll go make her stop. That's really why they're telling him. They're not concerned about Rizpah. They're not concerned about her health. They're not concerned about how she can go back to the temple. They're just concerned about how awkward all this makes them feel. And they're like, hey, David, can you go make her stop? Because she won't listen to the rest of us. And you're the king. And, you know, we had these people executed. And it just makes the whole country look bad. And they could have gone, not only this David, but, you know, Rizpah, she was with Saul, right? And Saul was so jealous of you, he tried to kill you multiple times. He sent you into exile for years. You lived in caves and in the forest. And you had multiple chances to kill Saul, and you didn't. And he was always after you, and God struck him down for it, right? And then they could have gone, and Rizpah was also used as a tool in the first rebellion against you while you were trying to consolidate this reign in which God had anointed you king. And they go, possibly Rizpah is doing this to rally people to seek vengeance upon you because now both of her sons are dead because of you. And David responds. One of the things that makes David a man after God's own heart is the way he responds specifically to his enemies. I remember hearing a saying once, and it went something to the effect of, you can tell the worth of a man by the way he treats people he doesn't have to treat well. And David gathers his men, and they're thinking he's going to go make her stop now. But instead, he goes down to Jabesh Gilead. Why does he do that? And there he collects the bones of Saul and Jonathan. So for those of you that weren't here or don't remember way back to 2014 when we went over this, Jonathan and Saul died horribly in battle because of Saul's pride and his refusal to repent before God of all his pridefulness and his desire to do things his way versus God's way. And so their bodies were stapled to the wall of one of the temples to the Philistines' gods. And then later on, they were paraded through the street, mocking the Israelites, mocking King Saul, mocking his son Jonathan, and in particular, mocking the Hebrew God, who was far, far inferior to the Philistine gods, as they put it. And so the men of Jabesh Gilead, because David's still on the run during all this, the men of Jabesh Gilead rally and make a raid on this town in Bethshan where the Philistines had hung the bodies, and take the bodies back and do their best to preserve the bodies and preserve their bones until they could receive a proper burial. And up to this point, they had not received a proper burial. And David sees this, and he's maybe convicted by this. And he goes to Jabesh Gilead, and he gets the bodies of Saul and Jonathan, and he takes them back home, and he buries them in the tombs of the king. He really goes out of his way to do this, and not only does he do that, he sends men to make sure that these executed men, these men accursed of God, also receive a proper burial. This would have been a tremendous scandal for the entire country, that these men accursed of God are now receiving a proper burial. They were supposed to hang there until they literally fell apart from their bones, and their bones would be carried away and scavenged by the birds of the air and the animals of the field. But he goes out of his way to do this, and it says they performed all that the king commanded. David directed all of this, and there's an aspect of it that I think can tie back to Numbers 35. In Numbers 35 it says, "So you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land. And no atonement can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it." The idea throughout the entirety of the Old Testament is that blood from unpunished sin defiles the land. And God one day requires that blood from those people and from that nation. But the hope we have is in Jesus Christ. And that is the only hope that any of us have. And we can call people, and we can, post things online, and we can do lots of things to be active in our communities, and I 100% support doing that. But unless God changes people's hearts, none of it's ever going to be of any lasting worth. The entirety, I was talking with Jacob about the book of Ecclesiastes today. And it's one of the few books I would encourage you to read the last 3 verses of the book first, and then read the rest of the book after that, because it sets the context. And King Solomon says, I did everything that you can do when you have limitless money and time. And it was all pointless because I did it without God. And the whole thing I've come to describe was just do things God's way, and that's what's going to work out. When me and Madison were talking about the legal system later, I followed up with, everyone faces judgment. And I said, however, even if one of these murderers who got away with it accepts Christ and is forgiven, they'll be in heaven with us. And they're like, what? I was like, there will be murderers in heaven. And they're like, you're crazy. And I'm like, the Apostle Paul was a murderer, and he's going to be in heaven. So I told the story of Saul becoming Paul, and how God's forgiveness stretches out across all of those things. So kind of the takeaway from this is, after all of this is done, after all the things are done in a godly fashion by David, God heeds the prayer of the land. He brings rain. He ends the famine, and the people are blessed once again. There's always going to come a time when God wants to deal with the sins in our life. And sometimes it's immediate, and sometimes it's later on down the road. But I found that he always waits until the time that we're willing to listen to him is when he'll deal with it. Dave Ramsey likes to say, God has 3 answers to prayer: yes, no, and grow. And that's it. There are many reasons why our prayers might not be answered. There are many reasons why they might not be answered in the way we wish them to be answered, or in the amount of time we wish them to be answered. But what it comes down to is how we should constantly seek God as we bring these prayers to him, to have everything addressed. And let it not just be for ourselves, but for others. Because our answer and our hope is only in Jesus Christ. David Robertson, would you close us in a word of prayer?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time you've given us tonight, Lord, to fellowship and to get into your word, Lord. We thank you for the opportunity to raise up our prayer requests and give you the glory for all the things we've heard that you've done in our lives, Lord. And as we leave here tonight, we just ask you to help us to truly be your ambassadors here on this earth. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.